Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It is wonderful to be here with you today. I'll wait for the folks in the cheap seats to quiet down. All right. Allow me to share a couple quotes with you. Quote, "This time, everything that we have is gone. Right now, we have no money, so we're just trying to figure out where to go next." Quote, "Especially for our children, getting back to stable housing is the most important factor." Quote, "Our hearts are breaking." Quote, "We need to bring these jobs back, but first my workers need their homes." These are the words, real words, of disaster victims over the past 3 years, expressing to us their deep vulnerability after they've lost their homes, after they've lost their communities. This panel, we're going to talk about innovation in post-disaster housing, which is something I know everybody in this room can appreciate. We already face a major housing supply issue, which is just exacerbated when there's a natural disaster for both renters and for homeowners. I am thrilled to be joined today on the stage with some experts who are going to share some of their expertise with us on innovations that are happening across the country. First, we have Taylor Marr, who is a senior housing economist at Airbnb. Taylor leads Airbnb's housing research program and works closely with Airbnb Housing Council. Welcome, Taylor. We have Carlos Martín, who is the Vice President for Research and Policy Engagement at Resources for the Future. Carlos has 25 years, I'm sure you would, just yesterday, of experience researching housing technology and the physical quality of existing homes. And finally, let's welcome Sara Morgan, who is the president of Fahe, a network of 50 diverse community-based nonprofits working to build homes and communities across Appalachia. She's an expert in housing finance. Good to know. We need more of those. Let's welcome our panelists, please. And as a reminder to the audience, because you may have forgotten this during your lunch break, if you have questions, please use the QR code on the other side of your booklet. And for those of you in our viewing audience, please feel free to use the link in the YouTube station chat that you have in front of you. Okay, Carlos, let's set the stage. Let's
do it.
We know that there has been devastating extreme weather over the past years, and it just seems that every storm seems more frequent and has more strength to it. Talk to us a little bit about the risk that we face right now and what's driving those risks.
Well, the risks are real. I mean, if you look at a variety of different events, including hazard events like wildfire and hurricane. If you look at flooding, for example, we already know that there are about 4 million homes in the United States that are at extreme risk. That's not to mention those homes that are at significant risk and a wide range of risk, and that will increasingly fall into those categories in the future. 4 million homes at immediate extreme risk of flooding, about 10 million homes at extreme risk of wildfire. So the risk is real, and it's happening across the country. One of the questions I always have enjoyed pondering from students, from journalists, from the general public is, where can I live in this country where I won't have exposure, any kind of exposure?
I'm sure that's a frequent question for you.
Frequent question, the answer is every place on the planet is going to have some kind of change, right? And in some cases, it's been a more elevated risk, certainly looking at places like the Southeast, like Florida, with regards to hurricane and flood risks. Out west, looking at wildfire, but the whole country is going to be experiencing higher temperatures as well that don't necessarily fall in the traditional disaster definitions and declarations, but those are also apparent risks that we have to be considering.
Thank you. And what you're saying is that there's no one place in the country that is safe right now. We all have to be alert to the impact of natural disasters?
Of many of us in the field say there's no such thing as a natural disaster, that these are all socially constructed, mainly because we build in places and we have exposures, and it's people who are experiencing them, right? So these are hazard events that are occurring all over the place.
Thank you so much. Sara, I am sure that the communities that you work with, that you serve, have seen their fair share, whether it's flooding or tornadoes. Talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges of helping families find short-term, temporary, stable housing, which we all know is just the beginning of the issue before we get to long-term recovery housing. But talk a little bit about how long does it take to place families and any challenges that you encounter.
Thanks. First, I just want to say thanks for having me here today. I think the part of the question we originally talked about was like, how long does it take to get people back into permanent housing? And I have some really disappointing news, folks. Kentucky was hit with massive flooding, unprecedented flooding in 22 in July, and the first federal dollars are hitting the ground to rebuild right now. And that's not for a lack of any work. We're talking almost 3 years later. I'd like to reframe just a little bit because I think I can give you a different perspective. I represent a network of nonprofit housing organizations. We have some very high capacity in eastern Kentucky, which was hit with the flooding. And I've got a colleague on my team, Pam Johnson, who the moment the flood hit, she jumped into taking care of people mode. Our network diverted their business model. They were normally built homes, and they turned around and started mucking out houses. And this is because we all leaned into our expertise. Disasters are, we're not set up to respond to disasters in our economy. That's just not what we actually have infrastructure built for. So our initial response was sort of a ground zero. We stepped into a role to coordinate. We clarified what the roles were for the people who were responding. Ours was leaning into our housing expertise because, quite frankly, the states don't have that outside of the housing finance agencies, and they clearly do. But from the development side at the state, we viewed a long-term mindset. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
And let me ask you a question, Sara, because I actually visited Kentucky after the first major flooding occurred, and these were really small towns where I felt like, would these towns even be able to come back because so many people had left? Talk to us a little bit about your concerns tied to that.
Yeah, so...
and put your mic a little bit closer.
Oh, thank you. When Secretary Fudge came to town and you guys awarded this Commonwealth almost $300 million of CDBG-DR, they came to Jackson, Kentucky, which is a town of maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 people. The mayor's the only paid employee. So in order to organize an event to thank the secretary and staff for this, she organized the venue, she brought the tables, she brought the water, she made the cookies. There's a lack of capacity at the state level because the state who manages those CDBG-DR money, they're used to managing infrastructure improvements or economic development, which is a very different animal. And the communities themselves, while the state's awarded the money, they've got to apply for the money. They're not set up as grant writers. And then you've got local developers. We had this network of very experienced nonprofit developers who knew how to use home money, but CDBG's a little different. And so we started to play a pivot role. We brought in some consultants to help bring expertise. And before the first dollar has hit, we were raising private resources to fund the ongoing work. And so we launched a Housing Can't Wait campaign because we weren't going to wait for somebody else to come in and take care of this problem for us. And initially, out of 8,000 homes that were impacted to date before the first dollars are hitting the ground, we had over 500 homes already.
That's
People
wonderful.
are already back in homes.
That's wonderful. You should be congratulated for that. Thank you. Taylor, let's turn to you. What role does Airbnb see for itself in recovery efforts tied to natural disasters?
Yeah, and just to echo, thank you for having me here. Great to be here. I want to first go back to a story back when I was living in Iowa. I live here now. I was living in Iowa years ago. Wake up at 5 in the morning to my neighbors, and my house was on fire. And it's a disaster. You wake up, it's unexpected. You grab the dogs. I had a little sister. My family all loads into the vehicle with a couple items abruptly, and you have to evacuate. And this is something that tens of thousands of residents very recently in LA experienced. Just no time to prepare. You have to hit the road. And where do you go? If you have family nearby, that's great. But the hotels fill up, and lots of people needed shelter, and shelters were also full. So Airbnb.org, which is a nonprofit part of Airbnb, founded out of Airbnb, was actually started in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, of a host in New York City wanting to welcome those who also were impacted by the floods. And so in LA, Airbnb.org was able to house 23,000 residents, at a moment's notice, basically.
Can you repeat that number again?
23,000 were, provided free stays in Airbnbs throughout, the region, Southern California. And actually, many more tens of thousands of people also had to book in Airbnb, and shows that there were, having these homes in neighborhoods and communities all over provided some critical infrastructure in the wake of a disaster. Of more than 80% were booked within just 3 days, and more than a third of these people who booked these stays also had pets. And so these are families that are fleeing, have nowhere to go, and having this both Airbnb.org funded and partnered through local organizations to provide emergency housing was sort of an immediate need, but also, again, we're talking about relief, and it takes a long time before you can go back. Even if your own home was not destroyed, there's still, logistical challenges to just going back to a neighborhood that was burned down. And having, a place that you can stay in for a month. More than 80% of these stays were within just 50 miles of where they were from. So it's people trying to stay in the same neighborhood, schools where they can continue to work and raise their children. And so that's a long process sometimes that people need.
So who picked up the tab? Who paid for this emergency housing?
Yes, so the 23,000 stays through Airbnb.org were all just through donations. So people can donate. Hosts, many hosts on Airbnb decide to open up their home and welcome people for free. If they have maybe an ADU or other things, they can house people, and people recognize that need. Also, a lot of funding comes through Airbnb from the company itself. Provides funding, but that was also just a lot of local partnerships. People raised up to recognize we need this flexible housing that shelters or other accommodations don't provide, and that's where the Airbnb's role is sort of in this new flexible space where when disaster strikes, you need something immediate and flexible. It might not be the long-term option, but this is the challenge around disasters and post-disaster, not only immediately but also recovery. As you're rebuilding your home or repairing it, you need a place to stay as well.
Was the wildfires in LA the largest event that Airbnb partnered with, providing temporary homes to people?
Well, there are maybe the largest natural disaster. Airbnb.org has also provided emergency stays for refugees fleeing Ukraine. And many other, Afghan refugees that came here. Lots of other disasters, most notably the hurricanes in Florida, Hurricane Milton. There were also a lot of emergency stays through those types of natural disasters. So there's a lot of different disasters, but LA was definitely a very large-scale immediate need, and having that critical infrastructure of housing there was really powerful in enabling that. For example, in some cities, you might not be able to house as many people that need that emergency housing.
Certainly innovations there. Carlos, you set the stage earlier by sharing with us that the weather, the extreme weather that we're experiencing now is very different from perhaps when much of our housing ecosystem was built, both our rental and home ownership. What should we be doing now in terms of how we're looking to build smarter and more resiliently?
Yeah, and we didn't even get into sort of the secondary and tertiary effects, right? Of people not being able to get insurance afterwards, people not being able to, thank you, people potentially having devalued properties in the long term. So we have to think about all of those effects when we're creating new solutions, right? Certainly improving new housing construction standards is going to be absolutely critical. It's a challenging one because then the question becomes who pays for that extra additional cost. But I and a wide range of other people have always talked about the importance of existing housing because that's the reality. Most of our housing was built in places that we didn't know were going to suffer certain kinds of extremes. So how do we do those retrofits? And again, the question comes up, who pays for that? And certainly there's a role for the individual property owner, for the insurer, as well as the local government to step up and make sure that that household can buy some time at least before the house becomes completely unviable in the longer term because of environmental challenges and the extreme weather that you'd be facing. So it's a wide-ranging answer to the question because I think it's going to take all of those solution sets. Right. One of the things that I've been tracking is the number of pilots that we've been seeing. Pilots in insurance programs, pilots in mitigation programs, pilots in municipal finance and reinvestment. Particularly in places like California with the California resilience districts. But these pilots are happening in silos. Like we need all of those solutions happening in the same places.
Are there any really super promising prototypes right now for strong, resilient housing you want to point us to? In terms of programming, I'd say all over the country and in very differing political contexts, right? In Alabama, for example, Alabama was the first state to have an incentive program for fortified home, for IBHS's fortified home program. New Jersey has a very thoughtful buyout program. The Blue Acres program. California has the California Resilience Zones, and they've been investing in a lot of these places. How do you change the nature of local finance to incentivize movement and more development in safer places, right? So I think all of these have to be occurring at the same time. So there are great experiments all over. They just need to be coordinated. That's right. We have to figure out how to scale the most promising prototypes. You're going to jump in?
And just to add to that, before Airbnb, I was at Redfin, and we had a lot of data on climate risk and flood risk, fire risk, and did some research on how homes are increasingly sprawling out and being built in disaster-prone areas. And unintuitively, one of the most powerful climate resilient things you can do is actually zoning reform that allows for more housing to be built in the areas that are more climate resilient. So, for example, in Arizona, a lot of homes sprawl out from the center over the last several decades into more fire-prone areas, and this is definitely true in California as well. And by allowing for more denser housing in the areas that do not face as much risk that's not necessarily a disaster prototype in terms of, it's like fireproof siding or anything like that, but it is really fundamental to, if we want to have more resilient housing away from flood-prone areas, away from fire-prone areas. Oftentimes, zoning is a barrier to that and allowing more housing to be built in those areas.
I think this crowd knows a thing or two about zoning being a barrier, wouldn't you say? Sara, you're on the front lines. How is resiliency being included as you are thinking about long-term recovery housing?
Is that working? Okay.
No, it's working.
Yeah,
you got it.
It's a complicated question in a part of the country where we have some of the poorest counties in the country. And so I really want to highlight a comment earlier from Secretary Goodard, where she said for Rhode Island, she said people should be able to live where they want. I've heard repeatedly folks are like looking at sort of my organization like, why don't you move people out of there if it's so poor? And there are reasons, like rural places are places where our food is grown, where we have natural resources, where people want to come for ecotourism, and where the families have support systems. It's been key to our mission from Fahe from the very beginning. We first built warm, safe, and dry homes for affordability. And so thinking about resilience is not just about the unit, it is about the family that lives there. The one interesting thing that's happening right now with the 22 flood is Governor Andy Beshear went out and started organizing what we call high ground communities, and bought property high up, flat land, and those sites are being used for redevelopment, and there are several of them where the homes are in the process of going up right now. And so that is one way, because those are not the houses on the hillside, if you will.
Oh my gosh. And this is just a reminder for the audience here and the viewing audience that if you do have a question, please use the QR code or use your YouTube link. Taylor, let's circle back to you for a second. You know, as disasters begin to shift where there are people living in more high-density areas, how is Airbnb thinking about its evolving role into the future?
Yeah, so part of it is recognizing that we don't always know exactly where disaster will hit, and we also don't always know exactly where those residents will need to go. Right. So having, connections with third-party organizations is really important, with local organizations where they can be activated immediately. So the speed of which we can unlock supply and connect people to where they need to stay is really powerful. As I mentioned earlier, about 84% of the bookings around disasters happen within just 3 days. It's often immediately after. So it's partly about protecting some of these homes to be available for families when they need it the most. It's also about recognizing it may look different. So some people may be displaced from their home and they actually relocate to a new city. And we see that happen a lot. In fact, we've recognized millions of Americans have relocated to a new city and had to stay in an Airbnb while they're finding more permanent housing in different cities. And so especially if it's a more urban context and there's very little housing available, that becomes essential. It can take a long time to find more permanent housing solutions. And so that's part of the evolving role, is really finding the partners on the ground that can help connect the people to their need.
Okay, thanks. One of the things that we've been hearing, Carlos and Sara, is trying to define or redefine the responsibilities for who's responsible for disaster recovery, both in terms of the short-term response, but certainly the long-term disaster recovery efforts. What are your thoughts about the right balance there between local, state, and federal? I mean, you're studying this, you're seeing what's happening on the ground. What are your thoughts about the right balance?
If I can start the conversation. Certainly, this is one that's top of mind right now among our policymakers. And all the examples I gave before were about hazard mitigation, the things we can do beforehand to prepare in the future. But I hadn't talked about the things we could do in the recovery and who should be playing the role and who should be paying those costs. And the reality is, any setup that we have is going to have its advantages and disadvantages. In some cases, it's helpful to have states take a bigger role because they help set up the local zoning requirements, the building codes. They can incentivize better construction and help deal with the local communities in a different way than the federal government can. The reality is the federal government has been a backstop for the last 50 years in this country. So to eliminate that is not thinking about the timing of how this can happen will put certain states at a disadvantage. A lot of states simply don't have the capacity to bring up this question again around states' roles, either in emergency management or recovery, long-term recovery in terms of housing. So streamlining that relationship between federal, state, and local governments is absolutely critical. But making sure that you're staging this in a way that can prepare all of the people, all of the stakeholders, is going to be absolutely essential in this conversation.
I agree almost 100%. And what I would add to that is that our response to disasters at the federal level is siloed. FEMA does one thing, it's very important. The redevelopment efforts are siloed from that. There's no alignment or coordination necessarily between those two because they're operated differently. And then our states are not set up. If it's a housing-related disaster, they're not set up for this. So we have housing finance agencies, and then we have departments like economic development departments where the CDBG dollars goes, and those two things are not aligned. And then you also have a network of providers who look like me, who want to, like, I want to be your friend when you need your next disaster. We have our next disaster. That organization in the field, like we're scrambling quickly to get to respond to people. All of those efforts are not aligned. My friend Nick Mitchell-Bennett, who's the CEO of Come Dream, Come Build down in the Colonias in Brownsville, Texas, will say states need a master plan for disaster response, and he's been advocating for this for years, so I need to give him the credit for that. But we need a master plan.
Thank you. I recall that during my last stint at HUD, there was a real effort to try to make sure that states were actually speaking to the state housing community, was actually speaking to the state emergency management community so that they were aligned and ready whenever a disaster hit, and they were not meeting each other for the first time in the midst of a disaster.
That is happening. We have in my region, we have a group who gets together and they're working together, but still their efforts are not. They don't have a master plan that aligns their efforts. They're still talking but working separately.
Okay. So we're talking a little bit about sort of the government's role after a disaster. I'm going to suggest, and I've heard you all say that it's complicated, right? Sara, you used the word siloed. I will say that, many of you know that I'm originally from St. Thomas in the beautiful U.S. Virgin Islands, and so, I've had family members who struggled to figure out which application to fill out, who do I fill it out with. Someone said yes, someone said no. It can be complicated, absolutely. What are your thoughts, the three of you? What are your thoughts on, I won't say if you had to change one thing, but what are your thoughts that if you were to streamline the process or try to make sure that the three levels of government were working with each other in a more outcome-based way? Based on your experience, what would you say that there's something we can do? And when we get to the Q&A, I throw that broadly to the audience as well. We welcome all ideas. What do you think?
Well, certainly you planted the seed for one of the most obvious solutions that have been proposed that has received bipartisan support, and that's a universal application. That would be eligible for across all programs. The challenge is the universal application throughout the country would require at least the federal government role, right? And so making sure that things like that kind of coordination are still playing out to have states mimic that later on is important. But universal application is clearly one, having a clear sense of where all the funding is. I mean, right now with the proposals that have been put forward, all of the previous questions that everybody had about how much money any jurisdiction would have had because CDBGDR didn't have permanent statutory authority is even more complicated now, right? Because now—
Can you repeat that last part about CDBG?
I will repeat it on all CDBG grantees' behalf. CDBGDR, disaster recovery, is not permanently statutorily authorized. So this requires a special congressional appropriation every time. Usually it means that the Congress over the last 15 years has said, for the last year of any declaration where there is still unmet need, those jurisdictions have eligibility for a grant. But that waiting for a whole past year, then you're delaying the recovery process in those places even longer. So that's another solution. The challenge is, then again, that's playing a federal role. If we're talking about who benefits and who needs to start stepping up to the plate, that has to be figured out while we're figuring out what the pots of money are.
And that's a bipartisan effort. I mean, I think our experience has been in terms of CDBG-DR being supported as an important funding stream, wouldn't you say?
That has historically been true for those specific legislative actions. There have also been a wide number of other, and I don't want to dominate the legislative conversation here, but I do feel like there's a wide number of bipartisan support, because clearly, as a country, at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and we appreciate the fact that supporting a backstop in the federal government helps individuals regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of their geographic location.
Thank you. Sara?
I would lean into the fact it needs to already be there so that we're not chasing, like, we had support of our congressional force in Kentucky, and it still took months before the award came, and then the process to do all the stuff you have to do, the comprehensive plan, all the action plan, all the stuff takes months. That whole process there needs to be an existing something.
Yeah, and I would just add that, ultimately it's an abundance of housing, of building more housing near areas that can house the people that, might have relief need, recovery need, but also immediate shelter needs. And the more housing that we have that, there are all types of policies at every level of government that can unlock that, but streamlining permitting and reducing the barriers to building more housing in general is really key to setting up resilience for when disaster strikes. And, even just nearby these communities, having more housing available is key. And also, as representing partly the private sector, is just unlocking the incentives that allow people to really step up and, construct more housing and provide this need when disaster does strike, that there's an incentive to kind of meet the failure of the market, which is, there's a lack of availability.
So one of the innovations that's been offered over the past couple of years in post-disaster housing is modular housing. Any thoughts on how to incorporate that, or do you think that there is any resistance to modular or manufactured housing as a post-disaster response?
Can I take this one first?
Go for it.
So there's a lot of stereotypes out there, but well-constructed, factory-built homes are a solution I think we need to lean into in this country so we get faster production. Freddie Mac has a study that basically says we're building today 1/10 of the houses entry-level homes that we were building after World War II. And our population continues to grow. So this is a critical need. They will, if they're put on a permanent foundation, whether it's modular or manufactured, they can be financed as real estate, which means they will appreciate for the home buyer.
We got some applause in the back there.
And we have two nonprofits that have Come Dream, Come Build, who I mentioned earlier. Nick needs to now pay me marketing fees for him. They launched Dream Build, and one of my members is franchising that in Appalachia. I also have another member who was telling my network back in September that they learned how to bring modularly constructed houses in, and he's figured out how to do modular footings. Now I'm out of my depth now because I'm not a construction person, but he can get a house 80% placed in under 5 days. We need systems change in this marketplace, and those are some examples. So yes, I think so, and y'all can disagree with me now.
Anybody want to get in on that, or?
I think anybody who can produce housing quickly is a hero, right? So the question is speed always, how does speed play out with quality, right? And so that, not in terms of quality of construction, but quality of the transition, of the transaction that occurs, particularly for people who are rebuilding their own asset. But all in favor. We're seeing a lot of great advances in that. There just has to be scale.
That's right.
For those to be financially feasible.
Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree that manufactured housing, modular housing is a key to unlocking a little bit more supply in especially some areas that can allow for this housing. I know of one developer in Colorado, for example, that was dramatically able to ramp up the housing production by leveraging some of this local modularized housing. And even better was that it was partially subsidized by some of the local funding that came from local taxes and transient occupancy taxes of tourists coming into the state, able to tap into that fund to support this modularized housing in Colorado was actually a really powerful thing as well.
So before we get to the audience questions, let's look out. Now, Carlos, I said I wouldn't do this to you, but I'm going to do it anyway. So let's look out. It's 2035. It's 2035. What does a more optimal disaster recovery system look like? What does that look like? That's only 10 years away. Maybe we want to go out 20 years. But what does it look like in this country? Okay, I can start with Taylor.
We joke that I don't even know what's happening in 2025, let alone 2035. So I'll be quick. It's one that centers the households, right? Particularly the most vulnerable households, and looks at their long-term economic outcomes and the cohesion of their communities.
Thank you.
That's the ideal.
That's good. Taylor?
Yeah, I think it's having, first of all, a plan in place where everyone, there's awareness. Like I said, even with my own story, it's unexpected, it's abrupt, and you have to figure out what to do. Often people don't know where to turn, and they're already on the road, they're fleeing. And so first it starts with preparedness, and I think that's a collective effort across every level. And second, it's having the technology infrastructure in place that people can immediately book it on their phone as they're fleeing, and not have to call and sit on hold for a phone, to get approval or funding for something. So having solutions that are more immediately available is very much key.
Thank you. Sara?
I agree with both of those, and I would just add, I think we've got a marketing effort with the people in our country and these places about how they prepare for this, which isn't done.
Thank you. Okay, so our first question. Natural disasters tend to have a disproportionate impact on renters, true. Yet most disaster programs are oriented towards supporting homeowners who suffer property damage. What are your thoughts on how to support renters after disasters? And Taylor, let's start with you, because I think that speaks to some of the modeling that Airbnb has done.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mentioned relocation, and that's a very big use case, especially when disaster strikes, particularly for renters who are less invested in returning to that same home, especially if it might take time to repair. They need to find a new home immediately. And, I myself, when I relocated from Seattle to DC, I ended up having to sit in Airbnb for a month while I found, more permanent housing. And that's the situation of a lot of renters. They're, often changing cities, or even if they're trying to stay in the same city, they ultimately need support to help find more permanent solutions. And I think having either a supply to do that, or the means in which we can support, those renters as they find their relief and recovery efforts take time.
Sara or Carlos, any thoughts? How to support renters?
The CDBG program has a relocation policy and plan that's allowed to help renters who are displaced, and that same thing could be replicated for renters in a disaster. It's going to be expensive.
Just echoing, CDBGDR has done a much better job of making sure that rental properties are redeveloped more quickly, and that they're included in action plans over the last decade or so. But I would say there's a lot to be done at the state and local level with regard to rent gouging and enforcing those, having a longer term for rental increases to ensure that there's at least some stability. But in the long term, it's going to be, to my colleague's point, we need more housing in these places to help level out those price increases.
Absolutely. Thank you all for that. Another question. What are the incentives that would encourage the private and nonprofit sector to participate in post-disaster housing? This seems like it's queued up for you there, Taylor, but you want to take the first crack at it?
Yeah, sure. I think part of the incentives is reducing the barrier of someone who maybe has the space and wants to open up for housing. So I mentioned when Hurricane Sandy happened, there was someone who had space in New York. They had a living space where they could welcome in a family who needed emergency housing, and that was completely nonprofit. It was free and started Airbnb.org. but also, sometimes it's not just the incentives, but it's also reducing some of the barriers that might limit someone to be able to do that. And so, there's about 4.5 million vacant homes in the U.S., and that's a lot of housing that could be available and made available to people if they had the incentive to be able to, open that up. And I think that takes, strategic partnerships to where people can know, hey, I have this empty home, or it could be used. They need to have that connection.
Sara, do you have a lot of private partners that you're working with?
We do. We raised a bunch of resources initially to deploy directly to our members, our HFA, our Federal Home Loan Bank System. These are not philanthropic necessarily, stepped up big. We have some individual investors who donated money. A bunch of our staff donated some money. But there is, part of the critical role for nonprofits to be able to step in is they need to see how they can pay for the work. And so I think, one, reducing barriers, and two, resources to fund somebody to get in and get started.
I'll add to it. So resources, the amount of resources, obviously are an incentive for private and civil sector, but the certainty of those resources is absolutely critical. And this comes in everything from insurance claims settlements to assuredness of certain payments happening. And so there are innovations in the insurance world, like parametric insurance, that will pay out immediately after the hazard event that help expedite and ensure that a certain amount of resources are going to be available. So,
I mean, we could spend another 45 minutes just talking about the issues around insurance, but that's for another panel. Is there a role for 3D printed housing in post-disaster recovery? Carlos, I'll pose that question to you.
Sure. The answer is sure.
Yes.
I feel like all the technological solutions there's a potential there, right? My concern, and this is less on modular and manufactured housing because there's sort of time and tested technologies, is that we don't make vulnerable households guinea pigs in any kind of technological experiment. So there has to be some level of certainty. If it's so great, then the higher income households should be exploring these just as much as they're explored with federal resources for lower income households.
Any thoughts about 3D? Yes and yes?
I'd love to see one.
Are there any?
Seen them on the TV, but not.
Are there any 3D printed homes that you're aware of in any of your communities?
Not in mine. I've watched them on whatever the media is.
Right, on TV or whatnot. Okay, so all the 3D companies out there, you want to talk to her. Okay, what can be done to an existing home and on new construction homes to prepare for natural disaster, catastrophe? Carlos, you spoke to some of this already, and Sara on resiliency. But any additional thoughts? And do we think that any of those measures should make homes more insurable?
So some of the examples that I mentioned, for example, the Fortified Home Program, create standards for new construction that make them insurable depending on this local state insurance rules. For an existing home, so part of the challenge is we're dealing with multi-hazard scenarios, right? In some cases, you're not just dealing with a flood, you're dealing with flood and fire at the same time. You're dealing with up to 18 different federally listed disaster declaration types. So for an existing home, it's a lot harder, right? Because some of the retrofit challenges are impossible to overcome. But there are obvious things like everybody in this room knows. If you're in a flooding situation, elevating the home. If you're in a wildfire situation, removing landscaping around and creating a harder shell around the roof and the exterior envelope for embers not to burn as quickly. So there are already several standards out there that exist.
I would just like to also point out, that won't answer this question, but both what happened in Kentucky in 22 and what happened with Hurricane Helene was unprecedented. And so I don't think there was anything construction could have done to change either one of those. Kentucky, none of the units were in the floodplain, or if so, it was just a few. They were mostly houses swept down hills. Hurricane Helene, it was roads washed away. It was crazy.
I mean, when I visited, it was really heartbreaking. And many people had lived there all their lives and had never seen the type of flooding that had occurred. And as we know across the country, many people are seeing flooding where they've never flooded before. So we do need to be smart about this. Okay, we've got 6 seconds left. One last word, real quick.
We're all in this together.
We're all in this together.
We're all in this together.
We are all in this together, folks. Thank you so much for your attention.